a Hamilton County court file from 1937, there is a will. It leaves $17,000 to a beloved niece of an old Cincinnati man named Jacob Wagner. Wagner had no niece. The name written into that document belonged to the woman who had nursed him into his grave, and she had set it down there in her own careful hand. Here's something most people don't realize. The story you're hearing right now almost stayed buried forever, not because it wasn't important, but because finding it meant digging through hundreds of documents that nobody bothered to digitize. Most of these tales, they're one water leak, one archive closure, one budget cut away from being lost forever. And honestly, I can't do this alone. Right now we're tens of thousands strong, but keeping these stories alive takes more than just views. It takes time in dusty archives, scanning old newspapers, piecing together fragments that history tried to erase. Before the story goes on, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you are listening from today, and what the hour is where you are. So many of the people in these accounts were left out of the record entirely, and part of what we do here is keep the ledger for them. Wherever you are watching from, you are welcome at this table. Now, back to the story. Before there was a poisoner, there was a neighborhood that made her possible. Along the northern edge of downtown Cincinnati, in the state of Ohio, lay a district of tight red brick tenements and beer halls and corner groceries called Over-the-Rhine. It had been settled across the previous century by German immigrants, and by the middle of the 1930s, it still ran on the old country. The signs were in German. The newspapers were in German. The churches and the singing societies and the funeral customs had all crossed the ocean intact and put down roots on the banks of the Ohio River. A person could live an entire life in those few square miles and rarely need another language. The years were the lean years of the Great Depression. Work was scarce, money was scarcer, and the ordinary hardships of age fell heavier on people who had little to fall back on. And there were, in that neighborhood, a great many aging men who had come to America young, worked hard through their best years, and then outlived the lives they had built. Their wives had died before them. Their children, if they had children, had moved on to easier parts of the city and did not come back often. What remained was a rented room, a small pension, or a modest sum kept close, and long quiet days measured out alone. These were careful men, the kind who had learned to trust their own community, and very little outside of it. Some of them did not fully trust banks, and kept what they had saved where they could see it. But careful as they were also lonely, and they were beginning to need the small daily help that no proud man likes to ask for. A hot meal, a clean room, a dose of medicine measured into a spoon, in a place that still thought of itself as a village carried over from the old country. That kind of help was expected to come from a neighbor, from a countrywoman, from someone who spoke the mother tongue and could be trusted the way you trust your own blood. The Depression sharpened every one of these weaknesses. Small pensions shrank or disappeared entirely. Grown children who might once have taken an aging parent into their homes were themselves out of work and out of room, scattered by the long search for wages. And the very idea of paid help coming into a private home to nurse the old was still new and almost entirely unregulated, a matter of neighborly arrangement rather than license or inspection. A woman who called herself a caretaker did not have to produce a certificate or answer to any board or bureau. She had only to be believed. In a community that measured a person's trustworthiness by the language they spoke and the church they attended and the softness of their manner, being believed was the simplest thing in the world for a pleasant German woman to arrange. The safeguards that a later age would build, the licensing, the oversight, the reporting of a suspicious death, did not yet exist in any form that could have caught her. What stood in their place was the good faith of frightened people, and good faith was precisely the thing she had learned to counterfeit. That expectation was a door, and it stood open in nearly every lonely house in the district. Into it, in the early years of the decade, stepped a young woman with a round, pleasant face, an easy warmth, and a gift for making frightened old people feel that someone had finally come to look after them. The woman Cincinnati would come to fear began as a problem her own family did not know how to solve. She had been born, Anna Marie Filser, in the town of Füssen, in Bavaria, in the German South, in the summer of 1906. She was the youngest of 12 children in a large Catholic family, and by the accounts that survive of her early life, she was bright, willful, and used to arranging the world to suit her. As a young woman, she gave birth to a son, a boy named Oscar, born outside of marriage. In a small Catholic town in that era, an unmarried daughter with a child was a scandal a family felt in the eyes of every neighbor. The story of the boy's father was told more than one way, even in Anna's own time. One version held that she had carried on with a physician from Vienna, and that the affair was what disgraced her. Another held that the two had actually married, and that the doctor died soon after their child was born. No firm record of that Viennese doctor was ever produced, and the truth of Oscar's parentage stayed uncertain then and remains uncertain now. What is clear is only the outcome. A respectable family did not know what to do with the daughter or the child, and in the late 1920s, they settled the matter the way many families of the time settled such things. They sent her across the ocean to relatives in America, and for a while the little boy stayed behind in Bavaria with his grandparents. She came to Cincinnati, where she had family already, and among the German community there she met a telegraph operator named Philip Hahn. The two were married around 1930. Not long after, Anna returned to Germany to collect her son, brought him back to Ohio, and set the three of them up as a household under one roof. For a time, she walked the ordinary road. She and her husband kept a small bakery. She rose in the dark and rolled out dough and sold bread to her neighbors, and by every sign she found the work joyless and the profit thin. To the people around her, she was simply Mrs. Hahn, a pleasant German wife who had come up in the world enough to run her own shop. No one looking at her behind the counter had any reason to imagine what she would become, but the seed of it was already planted, and it was not cruelty or rage, it was appetite. To understand how completely she fooled that neighborhood, it helps to remember how ordinary she seemed in those first Cincinnati years. She was a church-going wife with a husband in steady work and a young son in school. She kept a shop. She spoke the community's language and knew its customs and its griefs. When a neighbor fell ill, she was among the first to offer help, and the help she gave was real, at least at the start. Real meals and real company, and real hours spent at a bedside no one else wanted to sit beside. That was the terrible foundation of everything that came later. Her kindness was not entirely an act. It was a genuine gift, turned to a monstrous purpose. The people who later swore they could never have suspected her were not fools. They were describing, accurately, the woman they had been shown, and the woman they had been shown was warm, capable, and endlessly willing to care for the ones the rest of the world had forgotten. A baker's wages could not keep pace with the one hunger Anna Marie Hahn was never able to master. She liked fine things, and she liked to be seen as a woman of means. More than that, she liked to gamble, and in the Cincinnati of that era, gambling meant the horses and the racetrack. Betting money has a way of disappearing faster than honest work can replace it, and by the early 1930s, she was a woman carrying debts she had no lawful means to pay. She sold the little bakery. She began to borrow, and when borrowing ran dry, she found a better and darker source of money than any loan. She found the old men of her own neighborhood. The way she came to them looked, from the outside, like nothing but kindness. A woman who spoke their language, who was unhurried and gentle, and plainly at ease with the elderly, would offer herself as a live-in caretaker, a housekeeper, a nurse. In the old informal sense, the word carried before nursing became a licensed profession. She had no real medical training. What she had was the manner of a person you could safely hand your keys to, and in a community starved for exactly that reassurance, that manner opened doors that money never could. Once she was inside a lonely man's home, a second nature revealed itself. She was watchful. She learned where the savings were kept and how the bank was dealt with and who, if anyone, was likely to come asking questions. She made herself the one steady presence in a fading life, the hand that brought the coffee and the broth and the medicine. She positioned herself, patiently, between an old man and everything he owned. And she came to understand two things that would guide everything that followed. The first was that a certain kind of tenderness is almost never questioned. The second was that the same druggist who sold headache powders also sold poison across the counter, cheap and legal, to anyone who said they had rats. The instruments she chose were two. One was arsenic, the classic poison of the age, colorless and nearly tasteless, easily hidden in food or coffee, and capable of producing a long, agonized decline that a tired country doctor could readily mistake for a stomach ailment or a failing heart. The other was croton oil, a violent purgative that turns the body against itself from the inside. Between them, in the hands of a woman the neighbors called a friend, they did their slow work, and they did it in the full daylight of a trusting community. There was a reason arsenic had earned its old name as the poison of the age, and the reason was that it was almost perfectly suited to a killer like Anna Marie Hahn. It could be bought for pennies at any druggist as a killer of rats and insects. It carried little taste and less smell once stirred into coffee or food. And its effects, the cramping and the vomiting and the slow wasting away, mirrored so closely the natural stomach illnesses of the old that an overworked physician had every reason to write a familiar cause on the death certificate and move on to the living. By the 1930s, chemists had long possessed a reliable test that could find arsenic in a body once they thought to look for it. The trouble was that no one thought to look, because no one had a reason to suspect the gentle woman at the bedside. Anna understood that gap exactly, and she lived inside it. She presented herself, by one account of the day, as an angel of mercy, and she priced her mercy as she pleased. Police would later estimate that across her whole career of caretaking she had drawn somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 out of the men she buried, a staggering sum for that era, gathered a few hundred and a few $1,000s at a time, from one dead benefactor after another. The first old man to make her richer did not die in any way that troubled the people around him. His name was Ernst Kohler, an elderly resident of the German district, into whose orbit Anna had carefully placed herself. She tended to him, as she would tend to so many after him, and when he died in the spring of 1933, it emerged that he had left her something considerable. By the fuller accounts, Ernst Kohler left her a boarding house. For a woman drowning in gambling debt, inheriting an entire building was a startling reversal of fortune, and it was the first time the pattern showed its true outline. She had made herself indispensable to a lonely old man, and the moment he was gone, she was better off than she had ever been while he lived. At the time, no one thought to look hard at how Ernst Kohler died. He was old. He had been ailing. A kind woman had sat with him to the end, and then a grieving neighbor became, quietly, a woman of property. Old men died. That was simply the order of things, and the order of things was exactly what she was learning to hide inside. There is a wrinkle in the record here that honesty requires be spoken aloud, because this account does not paper over the places where the sources disagree. In her own written confession, given only at the very end of her life, Anna Marie Hahn did not name Ernst Kohler as the first man she killed. She named someone else. The most sensible reading is that Kohler was the first death she profited from, an early piece of luck she may or may not have engineered, while the man she later confessed to poisoning with her own hand was a different victim entirely. The distinction seems to have weighed on her conscience at the very end. It made no difference at all to the men who came after, because whatever she learned from Ernst Kohler's death, what she learned was that it worked. It helped her too, that the machinery for questioning a death was so thin in those years. When an old man died at home under a caretaker's watch, there was rarely an autopsy, rarely an inquest, rarely anything more than a tired physician writing down a plausible cause and a funeral home arriving to carry the body away. Death among the elderly was expected, and expected things are not examined. A woman who understood that could kill almost in the open, provided she chose victims whose deaths would surprise no one. And that is exactly whom she chose, again and again. Not the young, not the visibly healthy, Not anyone whose passing would prompt a hard question. She chose the old and the ailing and the alone, the people whose deaths the world was already braced to accept. And then she made those deaths arrive a little sooner, and a great deal more profitably, than nature had intended. That lesson, once learned, did not stay still. It grew bolder, and it grew more deliberate, and it moved on to a man who would teach her something new about how to make the evidence disappear along with the witness. The second man taught her that a debt can be erased, along with the person who remembered it. His name was Albert Palmer, and he was in his early 70s. Anna came into his life the way she came into all of them, as a helper who asked for little and gave a great deal. By some accounts, a volunteer housekeeper who simply appeared to make an old man's days easier. Palmer trusted her. He grew fond of her, and at some point, as fond and trusting men will, he lent her money. There survived, in the memory of the case, a promissory note, a written record that Anna Marie Hahn owed Albert Palmer $1,000. Then Albert Palmer died, and the note was never found. It had been destroyed, or it had simply vanished, and with it vanished the debt, because a dead man collects nothing. Here the method sharpened into something colder than opportunism. She was no longer only waiting for a grateful old man to leave her a gift when nature took him. She was removing the man and the paper trail together, tidying away both the creditor and the record of what she owed him. In her later confession, it was Albert Palmer she pointed to as the first she poisoned, writing that only God knew what had come over her when she gave him that first fatal dose. By now, the shape of her days had settled into a grim routine that the neighborhood read, wrongly, as devotion. She would attach herself to an aging man who lived alone. She would nurse him and cook for him, and win the trust of whatever few people were still in his life. She would learn the whereabouts of his money, and then, over days or weeks, the old man would sicken with what looked like a stubborn stomach complaint, and worsen, and die, while the kind woman stayed faithfully at his bedside to the last. Afterward, the accounts would be settled in her favor, by a will, or a check, or a debt that no longer existed. To everyone watching, she was the good soul who kept turning up at the sad houses of the district, doing the hard and thankless work no one else wanted. She was building, in plain sight, a reputation that was itself a kind of armor. The paperwork was the part she grew most skilled at, and it was the part that would eventually convict her. A trusted caretaker could present a check at a bank without much question. A will could be drawn up and signed in a sick room, where the only other witness was the woman who stood to benefit from it. A note of debt could be slipped out of a drawer and fed into a stove. Each of these was a small forgery, or a small theft on its own, easy to lose in the grief and confusion that follow a death. Stacked one atop another across several years and several households, they formed a ledger of their own, a running account of exactly how a lonely man's life savings could be made to flow, quietly and lawful in appearance, into the hands of the very person paid to care for him. By the summer of 1937, she no longer waited for an old man's money to find its way to her. She reached in and took it while he still breathed. The man whose name the state of Ohio would eventually attach to a death warrant was Jacob Wagner, 78 years old, a solitary German of the old neighborhood. Anna fastened herself to him with the same warmth she had shown all the others. What happened next would later be laid out, piece by piece, in a courtroom. Wagner fell ill in the early summer of 1937 and declined into a hard, wasting death, and he died on the 3rd of June that year. And Jacob Wagner left a will. In that will, the old man named a beloved niece as the heir to his estate, and to that niece he left $17,000, a genuine fortune for a working person in the depths of the Depression. The beloved niece was Anna Marie Hahn, but Jacob Wagner had no niece by that name or any other. The will was a forgery, and the hand that had written it, a handwriting expert would later swear under oath, was Anna's own. When chemists examined what remained of Jacob Wagner, they reported that his body held enough arsenic to have killed 4 grown men. He had not been eased toward a natural end. He had been saturated with poison and then robbed with a counterfeit document, and the woman who did it had signed his affection over to herself in ink. This was the killing that would finally be provable, the one where the poison and the forged paper and the money all pointed in a single direction. But at the moment Jacob Wagner was lowered into the ground, no alarm had yet sounded. He was another old man who had sickened and died with a devoted helper at his side, and the helper had come away, once again, considerably richer. The difference this time was only that she had left behind a document that could be tested, a signature that could be compared, a lie written down in a form that would outlast both of them. The will was not the only piece of paper that would betray her. Investigators would later point to a check drawn on Jacob Wagner's account and presented by Anna, written out in an English hand, that the old German gardener could not have produced himself, because he could not write in that script at all. To those who examined it, the check told the same story as the will. A woman had been handling an old man's money and imitating an old man's wishes, steering his estate toward herself, while he lay dying of a poison she had given him. Line by line, in ink, she had been assembling the case against herself, and she seems never once to have imagined that anyone would someday lay all those documents side by side on a courtroom table. If this is the kind of history you keep, the quiet kind, drawn from court files and old newspapers rather than rumor, then a subscribe keeps this ledger open and the next account close at hand. The story now turns to the men who were still to come, and to the one who saw it coming and lived. Barely 5 weeks after one funeral, the German neighborhood gathered to bury another of her charges. His name was George Gesellman, and he was 67, a poor immigrant widower whom Anna had begun to care for in the same familiar way. He died on the 6th of July, 1937, little more than a month after Jacob Wagner had gone into the earth. And once again, for her services in an old man's final days, Anna Marie Hahn came away enriched by a sum that different accounts place somewhere between $15,000 and $17,000. 2 elderly men, both of them under the care of the same warm German woman, both of them dead within 5 weeks of one another, both of them leaving money flowing in the same direction. In a large city in a hard decade, even that terrible coincidence did not yet ring the alarm it should have. The men were old. They had been sick. A kind woman had sat with each of them until the end, and then had grieved, and then, quietly, had prospered. There was no central authority counting the dead of Over-the-Rhine and noticing that a single name kept appearing beside them. The deaths were scattered across different doctors, different funeral homes, different corners of the same neighborhood, and each one on its own looked like nothing more than the ordinary sorrow of old age. The sums involved put the lie to any notion that this was mercy or madness rather than business. A caretaker's honest wage in those years was measured in a few dollars a week. What Anna Marie Hahn drew from Wagner and Gesellman across the span of a single summer ran into the tens of thousands, fortunes a working family could not have assembled in a lifetime of labor. She was not easing suffering, and she was not in the grip of some compulsion she could not name, whatever she would later claim on paper. She was pricing human lives and collecting on them, and the prices were high. The old men of the German district had become, in her hands, a kind of trade, and the trade had been good enough for long enough that she had stopped believing it could ever go wrong. That was the cruel efficiency of what she had built. She did not need to hide the bodies, because no one was looking for them. She did not need to flee, because no one suspected there was anything to flee from. She simply moved from one fading life to the next, and the community's own trust closed over each death like water. By the high summer of 1937, she had killed for money more than once and gotten away with it every single time, and success of that kind has a way of making a careful person careless. She was about to reach for one victim too many, and she was about to do it in the worst possible way, with a witness at her elbow who loved her and could not lie well enough to save her. There was one man who was handed the same cup as the others and lived to grow old. His name was George Heiss, and Anna had worked her way toward him exactly as she had toward the rest. One day, she offered him a mug of beer. Something in the moment troubled him, some small wrongness he could not have named. He asked her, simply, to drink from it first. She would not. That refusal was all it took. Heiss understood, in the sudden certain way a person sometimes grasps a thing they cannot yet prove, that whatever was in that mug was not meant to leave him well, and he put her out of his house. But he did not go to the police. He told no authority what he suspected. He simply sent the woman away and kept his silence, and so the pattern rolled on past him toward the men who were not as quick or as fortunate as he had been. There is a hard lesson buried in George Heiss, and it is that the whole machinery of her killing was stopped, once, by nothing grander than an old man's instinct and a cup he declined to drink. Had he spoken up, the men who died after him might have lived. He did not, and they did not, and that silence is part of the record too. The near miss with George Heiss matters for a second reason, because it shows that her method, for all its success, was never truly invisible. It could be seen. It had been seen by at least one man sharp enough to test a cup of beer against the woman who poured it. The difference between the men who died and the man who lived was not that Heiss held better evidence. He held no evidence at all, only an instinct and the nerve to act on it. Everyone else in that neighborhood had the same chance to feel that same small wrongness and turn away from it, and almost none of them did, because almost none of them could imagine that the warm woman at the bedside was anything other than what she appeared to be. Her surest protection was never the poison. It was the sheer unthinkability of the crime. There is one more shadow across these years that the sources only half illuminate, and it belongs inside the walls of Anna's own home. Her husband, the telegraph operator Philip Hahn, is said to have fallen seriously and mysteriously ill at some point in their marriage, in a manner never fully explained, and to have survived it. Some accounts hold that his recovery owed much to his own mother, who insisted he be taken to a hospital and cared for away from the house and away from his wife. Whether Anna Marie Hahn ever turned her hand against the man she married is not something the record establishes with any certainty, and so this account will not assert it as fact. It sits in the file as an uneasy question, and it is left there, unanswered, the way honesty demands that unproven things be left. In the last week of July 1937, she made the single mistake that would finish her. She had grown bold enough by then to carry her work across the country. Late that month, she boarded a westbound train out of Cincinnati's Union Terminal with two companions. One was her son Oscar, then a boy of about 12. The other was an elderly man named Georg Obendorfer, a retired cobbler in his 60s, a shoemaker who had spent his life mending other people's boots. The plan, as it would later be pieced together, was only a longer and more ambitious version of the one she always used. Take the old man far from home, tend to him, gain his trust and his money, and if he happened to die along the way in a distant city where no one knew either of them, then so much the better, and so much the safer for her. Anna would later tell a story in which she and Obendorfer had met only by chance, strangers thrown together on a journey, a man she barely knew. What undid that story was her own child. When investigators finally sat the boy down and asked him plainly what had happened, Oscar did not protect his mother the way she needed him to. He told them that Obendorfer had been no stranger met by accident. His mother had bought the old cobbler's train ticket herself. He told them that on the journey his mother had served Obendorfer a number of drinks, and that the old man had begun to sicken well before they ever reached the mountains of Colorado. Out of the mouth of a 12-year-old, in flat and unrehearsed sentences, came the thread that would unravel everything. By the time the three of them stepped off the train in Colorado Springs, Georg Obendorfer was already a gravely ill man, far from his home, in the company of a woman who had planned his entire journey and would soon claim she could not even say his name. Why she chose to carry the killing so far from home is a question the record does not fully answer, though the recklessness of it fits a woman who had never once been caught. Distance had its uses. A death in a Colorado hotel would fall to Colorado doctors and Colorado coroners, strangers with no knowledge of the string of Cincinnati funerals behind her. No reason on earth to connect a sick old traveler to a neighborhood 1,000 miles to the east. What she failed to weigh was that distance also stripped away the one thing that had always shielded her at home, the blanket of local trust. In Colorado Springs, No one knew her as the good German helper who sat with the dying. She was only an unfamiliar woman traveling with a failing old man, and, as it would turn out, with a pair of rings that did not belong to her. Colorado was supposed to be far enough away that no one would think to ask questions. Once there, Anna moved the failing old man from one hotel to another. At one of them, staff would later remember seeing the woman carry watermelon to the dying man, watermelon that appeared to have been sprinkled with something like salt. Obendorfer did not recover. He died on the 1st of August 1937, in agony, in a strange city where he knew not one living soul, while the woman who had brought him there leaned over his deathbed and told the room she had never met him. Police accounts of that scene are stark. She bent close and inquired after his name, professing she did not know the man, even as her own son could place her buying his ticket 1,000 miles east. Two things then happened in quick succession, and together they were her undoing. The first was ordinary theft. During her stay, Anna had helped herself to jewelry that was not hers, a pair of diamond rings taken from one of the hotels, and the Colorado Springs police began looking for her over the theft. They sent a routine notice back to her home city of Cincinnati. The second thing was the autopsy. When doctors in Colorado opened Georg Obendorfer's body, they found it heavy with arsenic. Now there was a dead stranger full of poison, a woman wanted for stealing rings, and a return address in Ohio. That was enough to lift the matter out of Colorado's hands and drop it squarely into the lap of the Cincinnati police. For 4 years, the deaths in Over-the-Rhine had stayed scattered and separate, each one small enough to be explained away by age. It took a body in another state and a pair of stolen rings to draw a single line back through all of them. The woman who had been so careful to kill quietly at home had finally killed loudly, far away, in front of witnesses and a coroner who had no reason to look the other way. The long silence around Anna Marie Hahn was about to break, and once it broke completely. What is striking, looking back, is how small the thing was that finally caught her. She had killed at least 5 people across 4 years and escaped every consequence, shielded by an entire community's trust. In the end, it was not the murders that first exposed her, but a theft, a pair of rings, a careful woman should never have troubled to take. Had she left the jewelry alone, the Colorado Springs police might never have sent that routine notice back to Cincinnati, and the death of one more old traveler might have been quietly filed away like all the others before it. Greed had built her whole enterprise, and greed, in a petty and almost careless form, was what finally brought it down. It was a pair of stolen rings, not 5 dead men, that first set the police on her trail. What they found once they started pulling was a great deal worse than jewelry. In Cincinnati, the case fell to a detective lieutenant named George Shattle, and once he began to follow the thread, it did not stop coming. He looked into the woman's recent past and found it littered with dead old men. Ernst Kohler, whose boarding house she had inherited. Albert Palmer, whose housekeeper she had been and whose note of debt had disappeared. Jacob Wagner, 78, with his forged will and his $17,000 and his body full of arsenic. George Gesellman, 67, dead within weeks of Wagner. The same woman stood at the center of every one of those deaths, and every one of them had left her richer than before. Shattle ordered the bodies exhumed, and when the tests came back, they told the same story again and again. The old men of Cincinnati had been poisoned. Then the police searched Anna Marie Hahn's home, and whatever doubt remained did not survive the search. One of the detectives who went through the house said afterward that they had found enough poison there to kill half of Cincinnati. Arsenic, croton oil, the working stock of a poisoner sitting in the home of the neighborhood's most trusted helper. Anna was arrested in the second week of August 1937 and formally charged with the murder of Jacob Wagner, the case where the forged will and the arsenic together made the firmest proof. Through all of it, she held to her innocence. She kept her hair neat and her clothing clean and her composure unbroken, and she looked, as she had always looked, like precisely the sort of woman who could not possibly have done these things. That appearance had been her entire method. Now it was the only defense she had left. Her trial opened in the autumn of 1937 in the Common Pleas Court of Hamilton County before a judge named Charles S. Bell. It ran for weeks and filled the Cincinnati newspapers day after day, and the press of that era gave her the lurid names it loved. They called her the Blonde Borgia, after the poisoners of Renaissance Italy. They called her Arsenic Anna. They called her Cincinnati's Angel of Death. The trial became one of the most talked about of its day, followed far beyond Ohio, the kind of case that drew crowds to the courthouse steps and filled column after column in papers across the country. A woman on trial for poisoning was rare enough on its own. A woman who had done it for money, to a whole line of trusting old men, and who might now die for it, was a story the nation could not look away from. The jury itself was a mark of how far outside the ordinary this case sat. It was made up of 11 women and 1 man, among the first times in Ohio that women had sat in such numbers in judgment over a capital charge, and they would decide whether one of their own sex would live or die. The prosecution's argument was simple, and it was merciless. This woman had killed Jacob Wagner for his money, cold and deliberate, and the deaths of the other old men proved she had done it as a matter of settled habit. Witness after witness took the stand. Hospital staff described Wagner's last agonized days. A chemist described the arsenic, enough to kill 4 men, that had filled his body. A handwriting expert examined the will that named Anna a beloved niece and told the court the writing was hers. The portrait that assembled itself in that courtroom was not of mercy gone tragically wrong. It was of a business. A woman had looked at the loneliest and most trusting men of her own community and seen, in each of them, a sum of money with an inconvenient old man attached, and she had removed the inconvenience. The presence of 11 women in that jury box was itself a subject of fascination in the newspapers. In an age when women had held the vote for less than 2 decades, and were still a rare sight in the machinery of criminal justice. Some observers assumed the women would prove softer toward one of their own sex. The prosecution appears to have wagered on the opposite, that women who had cooked for families and nursed their own sick would recognize, better than any man, how a kitchen and a sick room could be turned into instruments of murder. The evidence set before them was not gentle. The preserved organs of the dead men were brought into the courtroom as exhibits, the physical proof of the arsenic that had saturated them. Witnesses recounted the long agonies of Wagner's final days. And through all of it, Anna Marie Hahn kept the same composed and pleasant bearing that had carried her into so many trusting homes, a calm the reporters found unnerving in a woman on trial for her life. Anna took the stand in her own defense and denied all of it, and it did not save her. In November of 1937, the jury withdrew, and it did not stay out long. By the accounts of the day, the deliberation lasted only a couple of hours. The 11 women and the 1 man returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the 1st degree, and, crucially, they attached to it no recommendation for mercy. Under the Ohio law of that time, a 1st-degree conviction without a recommendation of mercy carried a single sentence and no other. Anna Marie Hahn was condemned to die in the electric chair. Whatever those jurors understood in the moment they spoke the word, they had just made their state's history, because no woman had ever before been sent to Ohio's electric chair. She went to her death still expecting, almost to the last, to be spared. Through the winter and into the following year, her lawyers fought the sentence, carrying appeals upward through the courts, until at last the state's highest court declined to step in, and the governor, who would describe her crimes as cold and horrifying, refused the clemency her lawyers begged for. All the while, by the accounts of those who were near her, Anna held to a private certainty that in the end it simply would not happen, that the state of Ohio would flinch from putting a woman to death and would soften her sentence to prison. She was wrong. On the 1st of December 1938, she was transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, the great walled prison where the state carried out its executions. Her time had very nearly run out, and somewhere in those final days, the composure that had carried her through years of killing and a month of trial began, at last, to come apart. In her last hours, She did the one thing she had refused to do in open court. She confessed. She wrote out by hand a long account of her crimes, some 20 pages of it, and gave the letters to her attorney, a man named Joseph Houdin. In those pages, she took responsibility for the deaths, wrote of her own bewilderment at what she had done, and worried, above everything else, about what would become of her son. She could not fully explain herself even to herself. She wrote that only God knew what had come over her when she gave Albert Palmer that first fatal dose, and that standing beside Jacob Wagner's body at the funeral home, she had been unable to believe she was the one who had done it. It was as close to an answer as she ever offered, and it was, in the end, no answer at all. In the pages she left behind, Anna reckoned with more deaths than the courts had ever charged her with, and the toll she seemed to acknowledge ran higher than the 5 the state had proven. She wrote of the men by name, of the doses, of the strange distance she felt from her own hands, as though describing crimes committed by a woman she did not recognize. Detectives who read the confession were stunned that she admitted anything at all after months of unbroken denial, and relieved to have, at last, most of the answers they had been chasing since the body in Colorado first turned their heads. The letters did not soften what she was. If anything, they deepened it, because they made plain that the woman had understood, all along, exactly what she was doing to the people who trusted her. On the evening of the 7th of December, 1938, Anna Marie Hahn was brought to the execution chamber. The prison chaplain, a priest named Father John Sullivan, walked beside her, and she is said to have had the words of the Lord's Prayer on her lips. Whatever calm the prayer offered did not hold. In her last minutes, the accounts agree. She broke down entirely, pleading with the warden and with anyone in the room to save her, crying out for someone to think of her boy. Her exact final words were set down a little differently by different witnesses, as such words often are, but every version carries the same shape: a woman begging to know whether there was anybody at all who would help her. There was no one who could. The current was sent through the chair, and at 13 minutes past 8 that evening she was pronounced dead. She was 32 years old, and she had become the first woman ever executed in Ohio's electric chair. Even her death did not quite close the account, because there was still the matter of the money and the boy. The confession letters Anna had written in her cell were handed by her lawyer, in the days after the execution, to the Cincinnati Enquirer, the newspaper that had chronicled her trial from the first day. The paper paid for the right to publish them, and the arrangement carried a single condition that tells its own quiet story about her. The money was not to line anyone's pocket. It was to be placed in a trust for her son Oscar, the boy of 12 who had, without ever meaning to, given the testimony that helped send his mother to the chair. The newspaper announced the arrangement in the middle of that December, only days after her execution, and published the letters across the days that followed. The confession ran that December, and the public of Cincinnati read, in her own words, the account of the slow murders that had moved through their neighborhood for years, while everyone believed a kind woman was only doing good. The same city that had trusted her, then tried her, then watched her die, read her admission last of all, printed in the paper that had followed her from the first day to the final one. The day after her execution, she was buried in ground that the Catholic cemetery would not consecrate, at Holy Cross in Columbus. And the neighborhood she had preyed upon was left with a hard question that the record answers only in part. The state had convicted her of a single murder and tied her firmly to 5 deaths in all. But the investigators of the day came to believe the real number was higher. There had been other old men and old women who died in her orbit, other illnesses that were never explained, and the authorities, by several accounts, simply stopped exhuming bodies once they had confirmed enough poisonings to be certain of the sentence. 5 was enough to send her to the chair. 5 did not have to be the whole of it. How many of the lonely elders of Cincinnati Anna Marie Hahn actually helped into their graves is a figure that the digging was halted before anyone could establish, and it is a number that now can never be known. What can be known is the pattern, and it is the pattern that ought to be remembered. She did not force her way into a single one of those houses. She was invited. She was welcomed by frightened, aging people, precisely because she seemed to be the answer to their fear. a warm countrywoman who would sit with them so that they would not have to face the end alone. She understood that a gentle woman spooning broth to an old man is very nearly invisible, that a certain kind of kindness is almost never questioned, and she lived inside that blind spot for the better part of 5 years. The horror of Anna Marie Hahn was never that she was a monster the neighbors should have recognized on sight. It was that she was exactly the person they had all agreed, in advance, to trust. That is the reason her case still deserves to be remembered, and remembered carefully, more than a lifetime after the current was sent through the chair in Columbus. Anna Marie Hahn belongs to a small and disturbing company of women in that era who discovered the same grim truth, that the roles a society hands to women, the nurse, the housekeeper, the devoted companion, come wrapped in a presumption of gentleness that a determined killer can wear like a disguise. She was not mighty, and she was not clever in any grand way. She was patient, and she was trusted, and she turned the second of those things into a weapon against everyone who offered it to her. The old men of Cincinnati did not die because they were careless. They died because they were kind to a woman who had learned to make kindness fatal.